Hi, my name is Jack Rackham, and today I'm going to show you the House of Braganza, once the ruling family of Brazil and Portugal. We'll be looking at how the royal family became divided, what happened when the countries it ruled over became republics, and who would be the monarchs in charge today. Brazil, which had been part of the Portuguese Empire for a very long time, since the early 1500s, was elevated to the status of kingdom in 1815 after the Portuguese royal family fled Europe amid Napoleon's conquests. Thus, the first person to rule the Kingdom of Brazil was Queen Maria I. She was known in Portugal as Maria the Pious, but in Brazil her epithet was Maria the Mad, because she had been suffering from dementia since at least 1786. When the royal family had fled to Brazil, her health had already deteriorated significantly, to the point that as she was being escorted from the palace, she was allegedly afraid she was about to be robbed or tortured. She reigned as Queen of Brazil for only 3 months before she died in 1816. She was succeeded by her son, João VI. His early rule was plagued by unrest and liberal protests in Portugal, which necessitated his return, as there was debate over the powers of the king. Liberals wanted him to sign a constitution, and absolutists wanted him to retain absolute power. João was actually a relatively moderate king and was sympathetic to the liberals. His son Miguel, however, led a pro-absolutist uprising in 1823, and in 1824 held his father prisoner, though with the help of the British army, the king was freed and Miguel sent into exile. At the same time, Brazil had been enjoying its status as a kingdom and was nervous about the possibility of becoming a colony again once the king returned to Portugal. Pedro, who grew up in Brazil and felt his loyalties lay there, declared Brazil's independence in 1822, despite being first in line to one day inherit it from his father along with Portugal. The War of Independence concluded in 1825, but ironically the two states were reunited only a year later when João died and Pedro, as his heir, took up the title of King of Portugal. Still, it was clear such a union wouldn't last. But Miguel was a controversial figure in Portugal, so Pedro decided that when his daughter Maria came of age, she would become Queen of Portugal and marry her uncle Miguel to tie up any loose ends. Until then, the country would be under the rule of Pedro's sister Isabella Maria, but she soon fell ill, and so the regency was trusted to Miguel. About 2 months later, he declared himself king. You'll notice in this picture of Pedro I, he has a pretty sizable beard. Pedro abdicated from Brazil after alienating the Liberal Party and left the country to fight a war against Miguel in which he swore off shaving until Maria was returned to the throne. He eventually won that war, and Maria II became Queen of Portugal for good. She married a member of the junior branch of the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, the same royal family mentioned in the video on Belgium last week, from whom the monarchs of Belgium and the UK, as well as the former czars of Bulgaria, are descended. In Portugal, however, the family continued to be known as Braganza. Unfortunately, according to legend, the family line of the Kohari branch was cursed by a monk in the early 1800s, and that curse appeared to affect the Portuguese royal family from this point on. Maria II died in childbirth in 1853, and of their 11 children, her husband Ferdinand would outlive 8 of them. Her son Pedro V lost his wife after just 1 year of marriage, and a few years later he died of cholera at the age of 24. Next in line, King Louis's wife Maria of Savoy suffered several miscarriages and he died at the age of 50, having led Portugal through a period of general stagnation for 28 years. Then in 1908, Carlos I and his oldest son were assassinated, making Manuel II suddenly the new king, until revolution broke out in Portugal and the country became a republic. He died in 1932 with no clear successor to his title, so the head of the House of Braganza suddenly moved over to the descendants of Miguel I, first Duarte Nuno, and then in the 70s, the current claimant Duarte Pio. He still advocates for monarchism in Portugal, though he is more than anything a social and cultural advocate. Among the already small minority of monarchists in Portugal, there are some who dispute his claim on account of Miguel's line being excluded from succession, although his descendants eventually came to good terms with the king, and strangely enough, the law that originally excluded Miguel's descendants from ever claiming the throne was repealed by the Republic in 1950. In any case, there are some people who believe that only the Portuguese National Assembly would ever be able to name a new king if Portugal ever became a monarchy again. Working our way back in time to Pedro I, when he abdicated, he left the Empire of Brazil to his son, Pedro II, who would be the last Brazilian emperor. Now, what's often the case when a monarch is overthrown is that they're widely unpopular or simply ineffectual. But in the case of Pedro II, he was actually extremely popular all throughout his reign, and the Empire of Brazil was stronger than ever. Pedro II won several wars, he promoted art and science, the Brazilian economy was strong, and he abolished slavery. In 1889, however, there was not a revolution, but a coup, and the Empire of Brazil was replaced by the First Brazilian Republic. Though the change was unpopular, Pedro didn't advocate for a restoration of the monarchy, having grown weary of his role in government and choosing instead to live out his life in retirement in Paris. His daughter, Isabel, who succeeded her father as the head of the House of Braganza, was also withdrawn from politics, despite having served as regent on a couple occasions in Pedro's absence. But let's say the Braganza family hadn't lost their control over Brazil, or that the current Brazilian government was to be abolished in favor of a return to the old monarchy. Who would be the emperor today? As it happens, this apathy towards the family's royal title continues with Isabel's son Pedro, who renounced his rights to the throne in order to marry a Bohemian countess who was below his rank. His father was also a male-line descendant of the last French king, so presumably, whatever distant place in line he may have had to the Orleanist throne, he gave up as well. The crown then passed to Prince Luis, who was vocal about his claim to the throne. He never began conflict with the Republican government, but he did become an activist, championing monarchism and progressivism. The title then passed through Pedro Henrique to Prince Luis, the most popular pretender of the Empire of Brazil today. He lives in Brazil and works along with his brothers to promote monarchism in the country. In 1993, Brazil had a referendum to decide whether or not it would return to being a monarchy. Somewhat unsurprisingly, the people of Brazil chose to remain a republic, but nonetheless, 13.4% of voters, or nearly 7 million people, voted for a constitutional monarchy, making monarchism in Brazil greatly more popular than in Portugal, even a century after the last emperor was exiled. So, Prince Luis is one contender for the current-day emperor of Brazil. He would be succeeded by his brothers and then by his nephew, Rafael. But there is another possibility. Prince Pedro, the one who renounced his title, had 3 children. Before following the claims to the defunct crown, it's worth mentioning that even long-ousted royal families like the French Orleanists or the Portuguese Braganzas still make a point to intermarry with houses of equal rank. Thus, had Pedro had fewer children, we might have a world where the Orleanist pretender inherited the Brazilian crown. Or imagine if that 1993 referendum went the other way, and somehow the Portuguese Braganzas ruled Brazil again. But Pedro had a son, Pedro Gaston, who became the senior male in the House of Braganza. And here is where I'll mention that Pedro's resignation wasn't required by the Brazilian Empire's constitution. It was only his mother who deemed his marriage inappropriate for his rank. Later, Pedro claimed his resignation wasn't valid and was never intended to disinherit his descendants. By that reasoning, Pedro Carlos, being the genealogically senior member of the family, could be the current emperor of Brazil, though he hasn't been making the efforts of restoring the monarchy that his cousins have. What do you think? Was Pedro's abdication valid if he wasn't legally required to make it and later reneged? If Pedro Carlos isn't an active monarchist, does that mean Luis should be the rightful pretender? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching.